Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the 32nd Annual Edith House Lecture. We are so thrilled for you to be here today. The Edith House Lecture is named after Edith House, who was one of the first 2 female graduates of the law school. She was co-valedictorian of her class of 1925. This lecture is dedicated to her hard work and memory for public service. This lecture is funded through private donations, and we are thankful to be able to host this every year in honor of Edith House. This year, we are extremely excited to have Edith House's cousins with us this year. I would like to welcome the Bentons. Thank you very much for coming this year. I would also like to thank Dean Rutledge and Dean Brown for their support of this event every year and for helping along the way, so thank you very much for your support. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Ms. Kelly Caffarelli. Ms. Caffarelli is a 1992 graduate of the law school. She served on both the editorial and managerial boards of the Georgia Law Review and was a member of the Order of the Coif. Ms. Caffarelli was president and on the board of directors for the Home Depot Foundation from 2004 to 2014. Under her direction, the foundation granted more than $340 million to nonprofits focused on affordable housing and community development. Ms. Caffarelli also served as director of the Homer Fund, which is a nonprofit financial assistance program that helps associates of the Home Depot going through financial hardships. Currently, Ms. Caffarelli is the president of a firm that advises mission-based organizations on making their programs more impactful and how they can improve their work to accomplish more today. We are honored to have Ms. Caffarelli with us today, so please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Carrie. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Carrie, and to all the women of the Women's Law Association, to Dean Rutledge. It's really been a lot of fun to be here today, to be walking around. I was reminiscing before I got here about my time during the early 90s and thinking about many, many hours in the library, like every law student. I was thinking about meeting my husband in a bar after studying in the law school. I was reminiscing about a lot of things, but one thing has really hit home to me today, and that is that I am old, because these young women don't remember things like Professor Centel. Does anyone remember Professor Centel? Okay, well, see, I was Holmes girl. And so I was, trying to think about why on earth I was getting a birthday cake with Professor Centel's face on it when I was supposed to be studying. So I've had a lot of fun. I do also remember when I was interviewing, and a lawyer in Atlanta said he asked the law school to send him the top of the class, and they kept sending him women. The gall. And I also remember him saying that if I kept wearing that suit, which was nothing but appropriate, he was sure I would get a lot of jobs. So by the 90s, this is the 90s, you would have thought that the world had changed more than it had. And it probably should have changed more than it has by now. But if you think about it, the Equal Rights Amendment should be a constitutional provision by now, because what it says is equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The first time that was introduced was in 1923, which was about the time that Edith House graduated from the law school. Mrs. House was truly extraordinary at her time. Not only was she a graduate of the law school, but she was also in the courtroom, which was something that wasn't very common at the time. And it's a wonderful opportunity we have to celebrate with members of her family today, her legacy for all of the women who are in the school today and who are practicing in Georgia. Most women at the time who had law degrees were lucky to get hired as stenographers or secretaries at the time, unless their family owned a firm that would hire them. And perhaps humorously, maybe not, as early as 1925, deans of law schools, Dean Rutledge, listen to this, deans of national law schools were surveyed, and they commented that women were as good or better than their male classmates. That was in 1925. Some things really never change. So in both 1925 and 1992, men recognized that women understood the law and that they did well in law school, but that still hasn't translated to professional equality for women. And I think that the attitudes in society may not have changed as much as we had hoped, but the way women respond to society certainly have. And as I was thinking about the various comments that have stuck with me throughout my career, a lot of them have to do with women's clothing and women's appearance. And I think that there's a reason for that. I think that people think that they can say things about the way women appear and implicitly mean they're thinking about what women should be doing or shouldn't. An example, when I began practicing, I was standing in the hallway with a male partner in the firm, and a woman walked by with a red dress on. And he looked at me and he said, "Well, I guess we know what she's selling." So most people weren't as direct or as rude as that, but I think sometimes everyone is thinking it, and we all need to be aware of the unconscious discrimination and biases that we have, both men and women. And I apologize throughout this for making generalizations about men and women, but I don't think you can give this kind of a talk without doing that. So to all the men in the audience, take my apology right now. And also, I think I send my apologies to all women, perhaps particularly Hillary Clinton, for I'm drawing a lot of analogies to clothing, but I really think there's something to be learned by examining the way women present themselves in the workplace and in society, not only in terms of their appearance, but in terms of how they're thinking about themselves and how they're fitting into the profession. So if we go back to the 1920s, when Mrs. House was getting out of school, Henry Ford famously said, "I pay our women well so they can dress attractively and marry well." Thanks, Mr. Ford. But I think at the time, many employers felt the same way, that women would work until they got married, and then they would move on. But by then, women had been lawyers for over 50 years. By the 20s, we had made a lot of progress. Women had gotten the vote, they'd gained access to all the state bars, they were on juries. Isabel Giles was a lawyer in New York at the time, and she looked ahead very optimistically. At the time, she wrote, "Before the halfway milestone is passed," meaning 1950, "there will probably be little discrimination in the public mind between men and women lawyers." And at this time, women were really looking for equality. In fact, they were actually looking for gender neutrality. And a lot of women were advocating for both men and women wearing robes in the courtroom, so you couldn't see any difference at all. And I know when we think of the 20s, we think of flappers and dancing and having a lot of fun, but really at the time, clothes were getting more comfortable, they were boxy, they were loose, corsets were gone, and it was really a boyish look for men because they used fashion to try to fit into the workplace as well as they could. And these women were really standing on the shoulders of the trailblazers who had come before them. In fact, in 1925 in Texas, the first all-woman high court existed. I think it's really interesting to know why. There was a association that was suing over a land dispute. Every single male lawyer or judge in Texas that was asked to sit on this court belonged to that association. So the only solution was to allow the women to sit in judgment of it, and they sat for 5 months. And I think they look pretty good there, don't you? But it was a short-time solution. And of course, the 30s were a setback for everybody with the Depression. In fact, legislation was proposed to forbid women from having employment if their husband didn't have a job. So while men were losing their jobs, women were trying to make do in the house. And most women were just doing that, trying to feed their family, trying to mend clothes, trying to make the little money they had stretch as far as they could. And only the very fortunate could get an education, let alone a legal education. In 1930, there were only 3,300 female lawyers. Sounds like a little number, but to put it in perspective, that was half as many female doctors as there were at the time. One woman who was particularly privileged and tenacious did get a job in a law firm, and she watched as her peer male colleagues began to make partner, and she didn't. So she went to the managing partner of the firm and said, hey, all these guys are getting made partner, why am I not? And he said, well, because you're a woman. If you were a man, we would make you a partner. And I think that there's an important point to be made there. She reflected on it and said, you know, to this day, this sounds like my grandmother, I think, to this day, I don't know why he thought I was upset. She resigned from the firm. But I think that it's telling that he didn't understand why she would even want to be in that position. And I think that society didn't understand that she would want that at that time. And it's not quite the same, but I remember being a young lawyer practicing. I worked a lot with one senior associate. And every day about 11 o'clock, we'd be sitting, and the young men would come in. And they would stand there for a minute in front of me and plan lunch. Now, it never dawned on them to ask me. I'm sure they thought they were going to talk about sports and that I would be bored and whatever. So I didn't say anything. I really just stood there and got my feelings hurt. But I reflect back on it, and while it was rude for them to do that to anybody, you know, shame on me for allowing them to do that and not saying, hey, I want to go with you guys. I know something about the Braves. Dean Davis is here. He taught me about the Braves. I have a mean hook shot too, don't I? Yeah. So, you know, for you young women, think about those out of office experiences because they are really important to you professionally. And it may just not dawn on someone that to invite you or that you would even want to go. But I would encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities. Now, in the 30s, one place that the times were different were in Washington. And it's for a very specific reason, and I thought someone's going to think something about this, but it was because the New Deal was being enacted, and there were lots of regulations, and there were lots of new laws, and someone had to be doing that work. So lawyers were in demand in Washington, D.C., and women lawyers were getting hired. Now, they were getting hired usually as secretarial help, but they were getting hired. And one exception to that rule was Frances Perkins. Now, she wasn't a lawyer at the time. She had a policy background, but she was Secretary of Labor for 12 years. She was the primary breadwinner in her family because her husband was ill and couldn't work, but she was very powerful and instrumental in instituting minimum wage and Social Security, and she understood that she had a very special place. She said this, "The door might not be open to a woman again for a long, long time, and I had a kind of duty to other women to walk in and sit down on that chair that was offered, and so establish the right of others long hence and far distance in geography to sit in the high seats." I love that she did it wearing a fur. Now, you know, you can't give a women's speech without mentioning Sheryl Sandberg and leading in, right? But she had, both Sandberg and Perkins had the same idea that if you're offered that seat, you need to take it with confidence, show your ability, and do what you can while you're there. Now, Mrs. Perkins was extremely unusual, and it's actually interesting to think about whether she would have had the same opportunity if her husband was working. So more women joined the workforce in the 40s, or in the 30s, but real change didn't come until the 40s, albeit temporary. Now, when you think about women in the 40s, what do you think of? Rosie the Riveter, right? Come on, y'all aren't that young. You've seen this in history, haven't you? I'm really feeling old today, I have to tell you. So anyway, Rosie the Riveter, she was an icon for women going to work in factories or wherever because the men were all off at war. And she took all kinds of occupations. Law firms were not any exception, and law firms started to hire women more as lawyers, some still as stenographers and such. And when they did hire women lawyers, it was made very clear that this was only temporary, that these were not permanent jobs. But during that time, women represented just 4% at the beginning of the 40s. That number jumped 400% to almost 22% by 1947, as the men began to come to war. The dean of the Harvard Law School was asked about the school's welfare during World War II, and he said, "It's not as bad as we thought it was going to be. We have 75 students and didn't have to admit a single woman." That was a close one. So while Harvard's admissions were not impacted, most everything else was. Rationing came about for clothing, materials were scarce, clothing became very conservative. The suit came in, and it was actually called the victory suit, or the utilitarian suit, because you could mix or match it. So you could have fewer pieces and still look different every day. Another point to take away, ladies, right? And men and women started looking the same. Big shoulders, wide lapels, fitted waist, and for the first time, women started appearing larger, stronger, tougher. And I wouldn't say it's coincidental that the statistics for law school admission by women didn't hit the same point as it was in the 40s again until the 70s, when we start seeing this kind of fashion coming back. So I really do think it says something about how women were thinking about themselves fitting in. Now, one place that's always a mirror of society is the movies. And come on, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, you guys have seen this, come on. So this is a classic, right? Adam's Rib, the husband and wife lawyers facing off against one another. Now, this one's worth an evening with some popcorn and a real discussion about how women are reflected in films. But I don't think there's any question about what we're supposed to think the right answer to this question is, right? The man is to wear the pants in the family. And Hepburn's character was feminine at home, but she was feisty and fitted and lapelled and shouldered when she was fighting off against her husband. So while the war waged, doors were opening to women, but society's idea of a woman's natural place really didn't change much. In fact, after the war, Helen Chade, who's a Columbia Law School graduate, was hired as a prosecutor during the Nuremberg trials, but she had to sign a form of disability. Guess what her disability was? Being a woman. So the war was over, the men were back, they took back their jobs, and women were supposed to head back to the house. In the 1950s, the idea of the happy homemaker, the man going off to work every day, was the idealized goal for everyone. Law firms publicly raised concerns that clients wouldn't accept women, or that women would take jobs only to leave soon to have a family. At the time, both Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor got out of law school and applied for jobs in large law firms. Bader Ginsburg did not get a single offer, and O'Connor received one, to be a legal secretary. A 1956 Harvard Law graduate surveyed the 34 women who had graduated in the classes of 53 to 56. And I love this. One of them said, "Beware of the firm that will hire a woman. They want you for work they cannot get any man to do." So some firms did establish quotas and did start hiring a few women. And one of them reflected, "I was so intent on proving that I wasn't like all the other women that it never occurred to me to fight back." Women were hired and they were relegated to areas where they would be less likely to make partner, and they weren't allowed into the male-only dining rooms, and they did their own secretarial work. Now I have one more aside for young women. You know, usually I like to be really self-sufficient, but I learned very early as a corporate attorney that all the copying and printing and no faxing anymore, emailing and everything always happens at night after all the administrative staff is gone. I was the only one who knew how to use any of those things, but I would not admit that I knew how to use anything because none of the men were doing it, so I wasn't going to do it. And that was my way of fighting back. So both society and clothing changed with the end of the war. Rationing was over and luxury and elegance were back. Fashion was about being feminine, and the notion of the traditional family with the man as the breadwinner and the woman as the homemaker was considered to be the one-size-fit-all goal. Cinched waists, full skirts, Peter Pan collars, and soft shoulders were the new look. But in offices, women wore suits with pencil skirts. Pants were not an option. And while the corset was gone, the girdle was born. It's no wonder women couldn't make it out of the house. Can you imagine trying to get dressed like that and make it out of the house by 8? I certainly couldn't do it. So the 50s continued on and was Leave It to Beaver and conformity, and things stayed pretty much the same in the early 60s. Fewer than 3% of lawyers were women, and the most fashionable woman at the time, Jackie Kennedy Onassis. Now, many women were accomplishing a lot during the 60s. Women like Janet Reno, Geraldine Ferrara, Pat Schroeder, and Elizabeth Dole all graduated at the time. But if you think about it, their careers were in politics and public service, not in large firms. A Harvard Law record in 1963 entitled Women Unwanted surveyed law firms and asked on a scale of -10 to +10 how they would rate being a woman in terms of desirable characteristics for a new associate. Being a woman scored -4.9, lower than being in the lower half of your class. And the reasons given included women couldn't keep pace, they had responsibilities at home, and they might get emotional. So the few women who were hired knew that partnership was beyond their reach. And the early 60s were essentially a continuation of the 50s, but change was afoot. Brady Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, became an overnight bestseller in 1963, and in it she gave a name to the dilemma of women staying home in the suburbs, suffering from what she called the problem that had no name, the sense of worthlessness and boredom women had. She told women that it was okay to say you weren't satisfied with a life at home, that you could have and should have the right to make decisions and have an interesting career outside of the home. The book really touched a nerve, and many women began to expect more in their lives. In the legal profession, some firms eliminated their male-only hiring practices. Younger lawyers who visited law schools to interview came back and told their elders that the most qualified candidates they saw were women. Again, funny how things never change. Now, not till 1964 did the Civil Rights Act come about, prohibiting employment discrimination on the basis of sex. Yet, a year later, NYU reported that 90% of the firms coming to see their students refused to even interview a woman. So women had a legal tool in Title VII now, but somebody had to be willing to take it up. And not until the fall of '69 did women law students at NYU and Columbia join together and sue a law firm for refusing to interview them. Now the law firm settled, they said as a courtesy, to avoid the litigation. And as the attitudes and actions started to change, so did the way women presented themselves. By the late 60s, women started to look like they were fighting for themselves. Sorry to Hillary Clinton. It was an entirely different time in society, right? We'd had the civil rights riots, we'd had the political assassination, the Vietnam War was raging, and it was the second era of feminism. Conformity was out, and women were presenting themselves in a more complicated way. Bella Abzug, who was a Columbia Law graduate and a longtime member of Congress, said, "Women have been trained to speak softly and carry a lipstick. Those days are over." So some women were choosing very short skirts, right? The mini skirt was in, and it was in as a sign of rebellion and independence. Women were using their femininity now as power and starting to fight back for their equality. Women were wearing pants, which was new, and a really androgynous look came about. In fact, some of these pictures, you can't even really tell who the guys are and who the girls are. So there were many, many battles in the 60s, but the real war against sex discrimination in the legal practice didn't really come about until the 70s. The women who had grown up in the 60s came out of school expecting to have more. And when the law firms told them things like, we don't hire women, we just hired a woman, so we can't hire another, women don't become partners here, or the dreaded, do you plan to have a family? So the major law firms in the early 70s, 10 major law firms in New York settled to ensure that women were hired as attorneys, and there were similar suits in Texas and Chicago. And what was the result? Women flooded into the legal profession. In the decade from 1970 to 1980, the number of women attorneys jumped from 13,000 to 62,000. Women now represented 12% of the profession. But these women still faced challenges and hit the glass ceiling fairly quickly, as they had few mentors and found it difficult to get good assignments. One woman at the time said, sooner or later, they will find a woman who will conform to their requirements, that you have to sound like and be like and appear like all the others who walked before. But it's not going to be a breakthrough for women. What it means is that there will be a woman partner when she conforms to the male stereotype personally and professionally. And that's not social progress. To me, that's discrimination. Now, the one issue that always comes up is the fact that women have to have the babies. So taking maternity leave was considered career suicide. Women were constantly cast as less committed, less competent, and less promising partnership material. So what did women do in the 70s? They tried to look like the men. Here comes Mary Tyler Moore with those big lapels and that horrible silk tie. For the first time, women were hitting the career world in real numbers, and they were trying to fit in. And by the end of the 70s, women represented a third of the law student population. The feminization of the legal practice continued into the 80s as the number of women surpassed 500,000, having quadrupled from the 60s. And there were still fights to be waged, as women at the time earned 70 cents on the dollar that a man made. And it wasn't until 1984 that the Supreme Court decided that the protections of the Civil Rights Act extended to prohibiting discrimination in selecting partners in firms. Now, both lower courts had agreed with the firm, which shall go nameless, that it could choose not to invite a woman to become a partner because of the partner's right to freedom of association. Kind of ironic that that freedom of association that gave us our first all-women's court in Texas in 1925 pops back up during the Supreme Court case 50 years later. So while women were making gains, they still had decisions to make. Do you have children? Do you have children late? Do you go into an area that allows more flexibility? Do you go in to be the most ambitious, hard-hitting lawyer you can be? In 1985, a survey of Toronto lawyers found that 56% of women lawyers were childless, and that 74% had no more than one child. Now, I hate to admit it, but the first thing I did when I found out I was pregnant and practicing was to go buy some clothes that would hide it for as long as possible. In the 80s, the women were facing the exact same thing, trying to fit in and show that we were just as tough, just as committed, and could build just as many hours as the men. After all, the 80s gave us LA Law, they gave us the Iron Lady, and of course, they gave us the power suit. Now, this suit didn't touch your body. You could not see a feminine inch there, right? Because these women were climbing the corporate ladder, and they were just as strong, smart, and tough as men. In fact, it looks a bit like a suit of armor, doesn't it? It's probably what the women felt like at the time. In '88, the ABA's Commission on Women in the Profession issued its first report that observed that the increasing number of women lawyers would not, in and of itself, ensure that women would advance and succeed in the profession at the same rate as their male counterparts. Men were still in charge, still making the money, still making most of the decisions. The term mommy track came about, and it was coined as an institutional way to talk about the decreased commitment, capacity, and ambition of women after they had children. Now, on the positive side, that means that people were thinking about providing additional flexibility. But on the downside of it, is no one talks about how you get off the mommy track once you're there. Women are always going to be the ones who give birth, but until businesses start to see it as a temporary inconvenience, just like it is for a man, then we're never going to find professional equality. I'm hopeful, though, that over the next generations, women will find that this has changed. And one of the reasons I'm very optimistic about that is because so much has changed every generation for women. In the 90s, I can attest that some of the issues facing women in the legal profession were overt, but that most were pretty subtle. A survey of women lawyers in '95 found that 85% of the women surveyed perceived a subtle but pervasive gender bias, and 2/3 agreed that women lawyers were not accepted as equals by their male peers. Women expressed negative feelings concerning having to work too many hours, having too little time with family, and the difficulty of balancing professional and personal lives. Now, what's interesting to me is those aren't really women's issues. Those should be people's issues. You know, I was traveling with a partner one time. I remember we were sitting on a plane, leaving town, leaving Atlanta, and I guess we were talking about family or something. But he leaned over to me and he said, in the course of this conversation, you know, I couldn't be married to a woman who does what you do. Okay? So I'm not exactly sure what he thought he was saying, nor why he thought it was okay to say that, but at bottom, what he was saying is, I don't really think of you as a peer and as a fellow lawyer. I think of you as a woman lawyer. And probably deep down, I'm thinking, you shouldn't be here. And at that time, of course, men continued to control most of the senior positions in firms. And I don't think that there was any acknowledgement that what women bring may be different, but it's also great and good and can be legitimate and can produce business value to people. Men and women are obviously different, but that doesn't mean that what women bring is less legitimate. Now, if you look to something called attribution theory, which is about how people perceive causality in the world, and don't worry, this is not about proximate cause, there's no Long Island Railroad questions here at all. But according to attribution theory, men are more likely to think that they succeed because of their own innate worth, and they fail because of something outside of them, bad luck or whatever. Women are more likely to think that they succeed because of hard work and luck, and that they fail because of their own lack of ability. And I've always thought that that's part of the reason women do so well in law school, is that we'll sit in the library and work and work and work and work because we think that's the way you do well. And you get good grades, and so that perpetuates that. And I also think that women need that positive reinforcement more than men, and attribution theory would tell us that. But I also think that for a number of reasons, women are less likely to sacrifice their life to billing hours. And as long as the legal profession judges quality based on hours rather than output, women are going to be at a disadvantage. One woman in the 90s said, "You get on this conveyor belt and never honestly step back and examine what you're doing." And I can attest to that. You start working in a big law firm, everyone else around you is working these crazy hours. You don't even know how someone can see a movie, because that's 2 hours that you wouldn't be in the office. And you don't stop to think what you're doing, because there's always going to be someone else who will be working harder and longer and more. And at bottom, law is a really competitive service industry. We're there to serve the client. And when they say jump, someone's going to say how high. And in the 90s, everyone was trying to prove that they were just as tough. We all got the memo. I guess we went to New York City, and we got the memo that we had to wear black and gray. I think a lot of you got that memo. And we all looked a lot like each other. Very few things changed. If you look at this slide, actually, they look pretty much alike, don't they? Now, women could start wearing pants, which the first job I had in the early 90s, I was not allowed to wear pants. Pantyhose went away joyfully. And the suit was no longer really armor, but became a uniform, much like it is for men. The 90s saw the start of the casual workplace, which was not necessarily a good thing. But I will say that if you wear a jacket and heels, women can get away with anything because men have no idea whether what you're wearing is okay. So that's the one upside of that. And I think things pretty much continued in the 2000s. You can see the statistics. Women kept growing. We were making progress, but it was slow and steady. And we're reaching about 50% of law schools today. And I've given you a lot of statistics today, but I think it's really important to remember that each of those numbers is an individual. And each individual has to approach her career in a way that's comfortable for her. I'll give you a couple of examples thinking about women that I've worked with. When I first started working, I was clerking with legal aid, and there was a woman who always would say that when she went into court with a specific judge, she wanted to look like that. It was kind of the use what you got theory, right? Now, I worked with another woman who said she never ever wears skirts because she doesn't want a man to see any vulnerability. So, whoops, I hit the wrong button. She wears that. That actually may show more skin than she typically does. Who's right? No one. Each woman has to do what makes her feel comfortable, and that goes for choosing what you do with your law degree, too. I mentioned at lunch earlier today with a few of the women that I really think a law degree is a graduate liberal arts degree. It teaches you very generally how to think, how to analyze, how to communicate. It's not really a trade school. It's a wonderful asset, and it's wonderful because you can do almost anything with a law degree. I work with nonprofits. My husband's a proud graduate. He is a money investor. My sister-in-law is a proud graduate. She's in management in a law firm. She does all the business side of it. I know women who are entrepreneurs. They're headhunters. They're doing everything. And I think that law gives you the ability to have it all in a way because you can choose what you do with it. Now, I think women actually are at an advantage because they're not told from being little that they have to go and get a job and be the breadwinner and be the head of the household like men are. We're told we can do anything. Now, I don't think you can have it all at the same time. Have to figure out what's best for you at each individual time. But I do think that it's a gift of sorts that women can choose whether they want to be a high-powered attorney and be as ambitious as you possibly can, whether they want to work a flex schedule, whether you want to stay home, whether you want to work for a nonprofit. You have a choice, and I think since from the time we were little, we were told that more than little boys are. And so I do encourage anyone considering what they want to do with their law degree, whether a man or a woman, and whether you're just now getting out of school or whether you've been out for decades like me, to keep your eyes wide open about thinking what's really good for you. And what do I mean by that? First, be aware that life isn't fair and men and women are not treated equally. As dumbfounding as it is, in July of 2013, women lawyers made 80 cents for every dollar a man made. Dry cleaners charged $2 to dry clean a man's shirt and $6 to dry clean a woman's blouse. And perception still matters. Where women are direct and strong, where men are direct and strong, women are overbearing and aggressive and, well, you know. In meetings, men speak more and they interrupt women. And this is well known. It's been studied for years. The same is true about how men and women talk about their accomplishments. And this brings us back to attribution theory again. Not only do men and women differ in how they think about their accomplishments, but when managers assess people's work, both men and women managers are more likely to think a man succeeded because of skill and competency, while women succeeded because of luck. Now, I debated whether to put this in, but I think it's just so good, right? Because that's how women think about themselves, and that's how men think about themselves. And I'll give you an example from my kids. My daughter is dyslexic, And when she was in preschool, she was having such a hard time learning her ABCs. And it was really getting to her. She was starting to feel different and like she wasn't capable. And I was really starting to worry about it. And I was talking to another mom whose son also had a learning disability. And she said he came home from school and said, you know, he must have missed the day that everyone else learned their ABCs because it couldn't possibly be him. So I really do think that we're born different and that we need to keep in mind that women and men are different and that we need to, both as employees and as supervisors, take into account that when we're assessing performance, that we have this internal bias and we have to act intentionally to counterbalance it and perhaps take an extra moment to encourage women. Now, while I've mentioned my children, I hope that the trend of thinking about work-life balance really does become a people's issue or a family issue rather than a woman's issue. We all know that families, their kids do better when they spend more time together, when they have dinner together, and we know that it's hard when families are working to come home and take care of homework and take care of the dry cleaning and get dinner on the table, and that shouldn't be the woman's problem to solve every day, nor should it show a lack of professional commitment. But for the time being, it does. And I think we must encourage firms and corporations in all businesses to continue to evolve to understand the way men and women perceive the world. Their work and their personal lives may be different, but they are equally legitimate and valuable. And until we get there, I also think each individual has to make choices based on what's better for him or her and what will allow them to create their best life. Now, while the traditional idea of career success will continue to be the goal for many, it won't be what everyone wants. And hopefully people will start to include all of these choices in their definition of a successful career. So some people say that the power suit is dead, that women are more comfortable and more accepted in the business world, so they have more choices about what to wear. At the same time, others can proclaim, long live the business suit, the power suit. And as a fellow attorney to all the students in the audience today, I encourage you to determine what's best for you on a professional and personal level. No one else can do that for you. And to find your way to fit in and to have your own definition of success. Thank you.